Greetings, and what I'd like to do in this video is spend a few minutes talking about Chapter 9, Violent Crime. And you can see that the author deals with some of the issues related to the history of violence in the United States, legal aspects, patterns and trends in violent crimes, and then the presentation of several violent crimes such as homicide, rape, uh, child abuse, robbery, and domestic violence, and then presents some information about the criminal careers of violent offenders, societal reaction, and also theory and crime. So I'll let you read about the history of violence in the United States, but I think what's really interesting is that if you look at the history of violence in the United States, you can clearly see that there is a great deal of sociological relevance by looking at how society has been structured and how that structure of society and social conditions are related to, for example, homicide rates. There's a whole lot of research out there showing that. And of course, what is of interest to us is how a lot of this research and these ideas and these historical patterns and trends can be used to set policies that would actually decrease violence in society. You also get some different terms used to describe different types of criminals, or, for example, serial murder, mass murder, and spree murder. Now, for exam purposes, I will use the definition presented by your author. I'll definitely do that. But what I do want to point out is that there is disagreement on these definitions. For example, serial murder, killing of several victims in 3 or more separate incidents. Mass murder, killing of 4 or more victims at one location on a single occasion. And spree murder, killing at 2 or more locations with almost no time break between murders. So you can begin to see that there may be some overlap there, or there may be some ambiguity. And certainly, as I mentioned before, that there are disagreements on how to define these particular crimes. That for example, with spree murder, the killing at 2 or more locations with almost no time break between murders. Well, how far apart are those 2 locations? And what is no time break between murders? Does that mean the time to get from one location to another? Or, are we talking about, different location within one structure? Or if someone goes from one house next door to the other house, or someone goes to a house, for example, to a school, and how much time? To try to differentiate mass murder and spree murder, I think a lot of times we just use the term mass murder and then differentiate that from serial murder, at least in the media, and we see that more frequently. Also, you see typologies of serial murderers: the visionaries, the mission-oriented, the hedonistic, and the power and control. The visionaries usually will suffer some major mental disorder and maybe have a psychotic break and hear voices telling them to commit murders. The mission-oriented has it in their head that they're on a mission to rid the world of a certain group or individuals. We've seen that one of the high risk for serial murder group are prostitutes, and sometimes we've heard serial killers who killed prostitutes talk about how they were on a mission to rid the world of prostitutes. And the hedonistic, which is more of a pleasurable seeking type, and then the power and control, which really wants to dominate over others. We also see there's some information about victimology, which is the study of victims of crimes. And we also have some legal aspects presented in the text, and then some information about trends in violence in the workplace and in schools, and then a little bit of information on gun violence. And that's real relevant right now because there's some legislation being proposed related to gun laws, and there's a lot of debate about that. I'm not going to get into that debate right now. But what I would say is that there is actually some research out there that could be very useful in framing these debates and looking at particular um, studies and what would be the practical implications of what we might or might not do to decrease the risk of violent crimes with guns. There's also a section on sexual assault, and the author talks about rape and shows you that there and presents two different definitions. So that's important when you're looking at patterns and trends of rape using government statistics, for example. You want to look at the time periods and the definitions that are used. But the current definition, penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. And then Groth and Birnbaum talk about different typologies of rapists. For example, the anger rapist does an attack as a means of expressing their rage and anger. The power rapist wants to dominate over the victim, and the sadistic rapist is a perpetrator who kind of combines sex and aggression into a desire to torture and torment and abuse the victim. And we've certainly seen cases of anger rape, power rape, and sadistic rape. And there's some other presentations of typologies presented by Glaser. And then they talk a little bit about different sexual predator laws, such as Megan's Law. There's a discussion about stalking, which is defined as deliberately and without justification following and or surveilling another person. And one of the things that is becoming a lot more popular in the literature is research on bullying, but also cyber stalking. Cyber stalking has become much more prominent with the age of social media and different modes of technological communication. And so that's a relatively recent area, cyber stalking, in that regard. I can tell you that even when I had finished my PhD degree, I certainly had studied and knew about stalking, but cyber stalking was not really identified as a problem yet because the internet really wasn't in wide use at that time. It was only a few years afterwards we began to see that come into play. Robbery is theft through violence or the threat of violence. So if someone comes home and their bicycle and their jewelry and their GI Joe collection and their Barbie collection are missing, and they call up the police and say, I've been robbed, I've been robbed. No, actually a burglary has occurred. Robbery would be if they were home and they were threatened with a gun or with violence. So robbery is theft through violence or the threat of violence. Okay, and that we'll see is different than the property crime of burglary. Robbery is a crime of violence. Burglary is a property crime. Of course, I don't correct my neighbors when they say I've been robbed. I don't say, no, actually, burglary occurred to your dwelling. I'm very sorry that victimization occurs in that regard, but it's important to get these terminologies correct so we can understand that certainly robbery is probably a lot more dangerous to a person's life. It is more dangerous to a person's life, obviously, than a burglary. Also, domestic violence is discussed, and there's a brief section on child abuse and intimate partner violence and elder abuse and kidnapping. The interesting feature is that you can take an entire course on any of these topics. You can take a course on homicide, you can take a course on child abuse, you can take a course on intimate partner violence, you can take a course on elder abuse. So really we're just kind of going over just a few areas. And with intimate partner violence, an ongoing debate that has been occurring for years now is the dual arrest debate on whether or not if officers come upon a domestic violence scene, do they arrest a primary aggressor, or if they see that there seems like that there's aggression on both sides, do you arrest both? Do they arrest the one that has the worst injuries, or how do they do that? And are they mandated by law to make an arrest, or do they have officer discretion? So there's different debates about this going on. Elder abuse, of course, has been an increasing problem in our society, related primarily to, as far as just proportion and numbers go, to our aging society, demographically speaking. And so you don't see a lot about that elder abuse, and there's a lot of it that goes on, and certainly we need more attention on elder abuse. And I'm very pleased to say that we have a new course that will be starting soon at in our department on issues related to the elderly and crime, and so we're certainly addressing that issue. I think a lot of times, for example, in sometimes it's difficult to determine whether there's a abuse going on if the elderly person does not have the capacity or capability to report. That it's important to have caregivers and others who are watching out for their welfare. That's especially true with financial abuse, which is a big one among the elderly, and often the perpetrator happens to be a family member. So that's something to always take a look at. And of course, I think prevention is the key here, preventing these crimes from occurring in the first place. There's also a discussion of the criminal careers of violent offenders, and the author talks about the culture of violence, which we already addressed in the theory section, the subculture of violence, which we also addressed, and so you can read over that section, and then also societal reactions to violent crime. It's interesting. One of the things about making videos and teaching classes is that I may make a video last semester. If I make a video last semester, there's something on my mind that happened last semester, maybe. So I make a video this semester, and what's on my mind? What's on my mind? Krispy Kreme donuts and coffee. But who cares about that? What's on my mind from a criminal justice perspective is that I read in the paper this morning at a small private college, fraternities have been banned, I guess, or I don't know, that the fraternities had to take a time period out from functioning due to the university defining them as high risk. And the interesting part was reading the article. It said, and this was not at our university, this was at a small private college, and I'm not going to go into details about the college or anything like that. It certainly is a highly respected college. But the article talked about that apparently several fraternity members of one fraternity went to the apartment of a rival, fraternity member and beat him up very badly. But apparently the fraternity members on both sides, the perpetrators and the victim, aren't talking to the police about it, or don't want to have any, do not want to press charges. The victim doesn't want to press charges and doesn't want to go through with it, and refuses to cooperate, apparently, from what I read in the paper. So probably just close the case. There's nothing there really as far as carrying out a case. And it's just kind of interesting feature, because I don't know if this is the end of it, but how does that get classified? That's what I was kind of interested in. How does that get classified? What kind of crime? How is that conceptualized by the community, by the college, by the fraternities, and so of course, what I do nowadays, years ago, back in the day, I would get on my bicycle and ride to the scene or where these people might be and interview them and talk to them and find out their perspective and get some ideas. But why bother when I can stay in my house and look on Facebook and Twitter and get some of the societal reactions as well. What's interesting about this is that there are different reactions from different groups, and so that's what I just want to say on that. And again, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but I think again, think about how we conceptualize different crimes and how we make sense of crime, because that's real important in how we think about our theories and our policies. And then the author uh, does a nice job wrapping up with a discussion of theory and crime related to violence, and states that the biological and psychological theories of crime have the greatest explanatory power when applied to individual cases of violence. And I would say that the sociological obviously have the greatest explanatory power when applied to looking at the societal levels of violence. For example, comparing different communities. And the example I would mention is the state stress index and enemy theory that we discussed in a previous chapter. And then your author recommends some policies that include substance abuse treatment programs and family conflict resolution skills. There's a lot more, of course, that goes on there at different levels in the community, whether it be, at a state level or federal level or at a localized community level. And if it has to do with different institutions, for example, the schools or the religious institutions or the medical institutions, or the whole thing is to look at the big picture. That, I think, gives you a much better idea of what to do. Certainly, I do not think any of the community members are at risk from fraternities, not at all. And I would have no problem walking by where the crime occurred at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I would feel very safe, given that I know that there's not much crime in that community at all. Violent crime is almost unheard of, as far as I can tell, and property crime, though, especially theft from unlocked vehicles, seem to be the big problem. And really, from where I'm sitting, that's a good situation to be in when you're complaining about people stealing stuff from an unlocked car, and that's a problem, rather than people getting robbed or people getting beat up or assaulted and things of that nature. In other communities, the situation is high violence and high property crime, and we got to come up with probably community-based interventions that are specific to address the problem. And also, also feel free to look at any of my other YouTube videos on violence. I probably have about 40 or 50 out there, so you can always just glance through my YouTube site and select whatever might be of interest. And of course, what will be on the exam will be stuff that I put inside of our course and link and tell you will be on the exam. I don't expect you to look at all of 40 or 50 of those videos. Although a couple of them I understand work to cure insomnia. Anyway, I'm going to wrap things up here, and again, what I want you to do is step outside of your normal thought process and look at violence from a variety of different angles, using the theories and the tools that we have already discussed. And thank you, and have a nice day or evening.